Another factor that keeps government officials and institutions within the boundaries of the Constitution is the concept of judicial review.
There's absolutely no question that the framers had a fairly strong, if still somewhat new, concept of judicial review. Secondly, there's no question that they saw judicial review as the principal mechanism for resolving federalism disputes as to whether or not the national or the state governments were exercising their appropriate powers. And the easiest proof for this is you just look at the supremacy clause of the Constitution. So I think the idea that judicial review is something that has to be created by John Marshall, 15 years later or whatever, in Marbury versus Madison, it's one of those myths that law professors like to tell each other, but it doesn't have much to do with the history. It's clearly part of the original understanding. What's not clear at the beginning is how judges will apply that power. What rules of interpretation will they apply to judge the legitimacy and the legality of the acts of other branches of government?
The very basis of government, as it is established in the United States, suggests that the people have the power to govern themselves. To the framers, however, this held certain risks.
Again, this speaks to the genius of Madison. Madison had the notion that, yes, majorities should rule, but all voices should be heard. And no one should ever dominate the other, but no one should ever be shut out either. In our time, we think of states' rights in the sense of George Wallace standing in a schoolhouse door stopping other people from enjoying their liberty. Madison was one of the few founders who anticipated the evils of local majority.
There's a real emphasis by Madison and his colleagues on representation of the variety of interests in society. And there was an abiding faith that whether through constitutional procedures of separation of powers or through just sheer representation, that is popular election, that the best republic is one in which the variety of interests all participated in the outcome. Looking at modern American politics with interest groups and those things that we are very suspicious and cynical about, I think that James Madison and many of the other framers would be heartened by it, that there was no one faction or one singular definition of the nation that prevailed. It took if not a consensus, at least a deliberation in which all of these interests had a real influence over the outcome.
Direct rule by the people was limited. In fact, the House of Representatives was the only institution that would even be based on direct popular vote.
Framers talked about direct democracy, but they voted against it. In fact, they voted against direct election of the president. That's why we have the Electoral College. They voted against direct election of senators. We needed an early 20th century amendment to change that. They were afraid of the factions forming and overrunning the rights of those who didn't agree with them, in effect sort of countering what the courts are set up to do, which is protect the basic rights of minorities.
Even the process by which the people, through their representatives, can amend the Constitution is difficult.
There have been periods in which there have been quite a few amendments in a short period of time. The Bill of Rights, the post-Civil War amendments, even at some points in the 20th century, the Constitution has been amended quite often. But big amendments have proved extremely difficult to pass in our time. The ERA, for example, the Balanced Budget Amendment, one would have thought that would have been a no-brainer, and yet it never even made it through Congress. I don't expect the Constitution to change very much through amendment. It changes through interpretation, and that's the way it should be.
Its language for most of the important provisions is very general, so that it can be interpreted in ways that accommodate changes in understanding. Now, some people think that's not how the Constitution is supposed to be interpreted, but if it was interpreted in a very rigid way, I think it wouldn't have lasted nearly as long.